The front door of the grand mansion swung open just as a terrified cry echoed through the marble hallway. What Jonathan Carter saw in that single heartbreaking moment would change his family forever. His heavily pregnant wife, Grace, stood trembling with tears streaming down her face while his own mother towered over her with cold eyes and cruel words. A shattered porcelain vase lay across the polished floor, and the woman carrying his unborn child looked as though every ounce of hope had been stripped from her heart. Jonathan had traveled home a day earlier than expected, believing he was returning to surprise the love of his life. Instead, he walked into the darkest moment of his marriage. Before we continue, if you believe kindness is stronger than pride, and that everyone deserves love and a second chance, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends, and leave a comment below. Your support helps us continue bringing heartfelt stories that inspire millions around the world. Jonathan Carter was one of the youngest real estate developers in Texas, where his company had transformed forgotten neighborhoods into thriving communities. Although he had earned enormous wealth before turning 40, success had never erased the humble values his late father had taught him. Grace had entered his life 3 years earlier while volunteering at a community food bank in Dallas. She wasn't impressed by expensive suits or luxury cars. She admired compassion, honesty, and quiet strength. Their love grew naturally, and despite coming from completely different backgrounds, they built a marriage filled with trust, respect, and genuine happiness. The only person who never accepted Grace was Jonathan's widowed mother, Margaret Carter. Margaret had spent decades protecting the Carter family's reputation among wealthy social circles. She believed her son should have married someone from an influential family instead of a former elementary school teacher whose parents had worked ordinary jobs. Even after the wedding, Margaret never openly celebrated the marriage. She disguised her insults as advice, criticized Grace's appearance, questioned her education, and constantly reminded her that she would never truly belong inside the Carter mansion. Grace endured every painful remark because she loved Jonathan deeply. She knew how much he respected his mother and never wanted to become the reason for conflict between them. Whenever Jonathan asked whether everything was all right during his frequent business trips, Grace always smiled and assured him that everything was perfect. She carried every burden silently, hoping that one day Margaret's heart would soften, especially after learning that Grace was expecting the family's first grandchild. Instead of becoming kinder, Margaret became even more controlling. She insisted that Grace wasn't capable of raising a Carter heir properly. She criticized every meal she ate, every doctor appointment she attended, and every decision she made regarding the baby's future. The mansion that once felt like a dream slowly became a prison filled with emotional wounds. Grace often sat alone in the nursery they had prepared together, gently placing her hands over her growing belly while whispering promises that her child would always know unconditional love. Jonathan had no idea how much his wife was suffering because Margaret carefully behaved like the perfect mother whenever he was home. She smiled warmly during family dinners, praised Grace in front of him, and waited until he traveled again before revealing her true cruelty. Grace believed protecting Jonathan from the painful truth was an act of love, never realizing that silence was allowing the pain to grow stronger. Everything changed during Jonathan's unexpected return. A meeting in Chicago had ended ahead of schedule, and he decided not to tell anyone he was flying home early. He imagined surprising Grace with flowers and taking her out for a quiet dinner before the baby arrived. Instead, he stepped inside just in time to witness Margaret pointing toward the front door while Grace struggled to balance herself after being pushed against a table. The broken vase on the floor had shattered after Grace instinctively reached out to protect herself and her unborn child. Jonathan froze for only a second before rushing across the room. He gently wrapped his arms around Grace, whose entire body was shaking uncontrollably. The fear in her eyes was unlike anything he had ever seen. It wasn't simply sadness. It was the exhausted expression of someone who had survived countless invisible battles alone. Margaret immediately tried to explain away what had happened, claiming Grace had become emotional because of pregnancy hormones. But Jonathan had arrived too early for excuses. He had seen enough to recognize the truth. The tears, the trembling hands, the broken confidence, and the unbearable silence all revealed a story much bigger than the shattered vase lying on the floor. Grace could no longer hide the truth. Months of buried pain finally poured out. She described the endless insults, the humiliation in front of household staff, the cruel accusations that she would never be worthy of carrying the Carter family name, and the constant emotional pressure that had left her feeling isolated inside her own home. She admitted that every night she cried herself to sleep, praying only for the strength to protect her unborn child from the bitterness surrounding them. Jonathan felt his heart breaking with every sentence. The woman who had filled his life with joy had been suffering alone while he believed everything was fine. He realized that his desire to keep peace within the family had unintentionally allowed injustice to flourish. Looking into Grace's tear-filled eyes, he silently promised himself that he would never fail her again. That evening Jonathan made the hardest decision of his life. Respecting his mother could never come before protecting his wife and unborn child. He arranged for Margaret to move into another luxury property the family owned nearby, ensuring she would always be financially comfortable while making it clear that emotional abuse would never again be tolerated under his roof. It was not an act of revenge but a firm boundary built on love, responsibility, and truth. The following weeks became a season of healing. Jonathan canceled unnecessary business trips and devoted his time entirely to Grace. Together they attended every prenatal appointment, decorated the nursery with laughter instead of fear, and slowly replaced painful memories with hopeful ones. For the first time in months, Grace smiled without forcing herself. The mansion no longer echoed with criticism. It echoed with peace. Margaret initially refused to accept responsibility. She convinced herself that she had only wanted what was best for the family. But loneliness has a way of forcing people to confront the truths they spend years avoiding. Living by herself, she found old family photo albums and letters written by her late husband. One particular letter reminded her that true family wealth was never measured by status or reputation but by kindness shown during life's most difficult moments. Reading those words again after many years broke something inside her heart. She began remembering the young woman Grace had been when she first entered the family. Grace had always shown respect despite receiving very little in return. She had celebrated every holiday, cared for Jonathan during stressful seasons, and continued showing compassion even while being mistreated. Margaret finally realized that she had mistaken humility for weakness and kindness for inferiority. The shame became almost unbearable. Several months later, shortly before the baby's due date, Margaret requested permission to visit. Jonathan hesitated, but Grace surprised him by agreeing. She believed forgiveness did not erase painful memories, but it could prevent those memories from poisoning the future. When Margaret arrived, she looked nothing like the proud woman who once controlled every room she entered. Tears filled her eyes before she even reached the front porch. She apologized sincerely, taking full responsibility for every cruel action and every hurtful word. There were no excuses, no attempts to justify her behavior, only genuine remorse from a heart finally awakened. Grace accepted the apology with quiet grace. Trust would take time to rebuild, but forgiveness allowed healing to begin. Jonathan watched the two women embrace gently, realizing that real strength isn't found in winning arguments but in choosing compassion when bitterness seems easier. A few weeks later, Grace safely gave birth to a beautiful baby girl they named Abigail. As Jonathan held his daughter for the first time, he realized that the greatest inheritance he could ever give her wasn't the Carter fortune. It was the courage to stand beside those she loved, the wisdom to recognize hidden pain, and the strength to protect kindness no matter how difficult the circumstances became. The Carter family slowly found a new beginning. Margaret became a devoted grandmother who spent every opportunity proving that people can truly change when they confront their mistakes with honesty and humility. Jonathan never again ignored warning signs inside his home, and Grace blossomed into the joyful mother she had always dreamed of becoming. Their mansion was no longer remembered for wealth or luxury but for becoming a place where forgiveness rebuilt what pride had almost destroyed. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that love should always protect rather than control, please support the channel by liking this video, subscribing, sharing it with someone who needs hope today, and turning on notifications so you never miss another inspiring story. Special comment request: tell us in the comments, do you believe Jonathan made the right decision by protecting his wife, even though it meant standing against his own mother? Sometimes the strongest families are not the ones that never face storms, but the ones that choose love, truth, forgiveness, and courage when those storms arrive. And in the end, that choice became the greatest gift little Abigail would ever inherit.